Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from. Welcome to another episode of LinkedIn Live Industry Insights from Veeam. If you're really paying attention, you're going to notice that Jason Buffington is not currently in frame. That is because in the United States, at least, although I know in Spain, we're getting some interesting weather, snowstorms where places and people usually don't experience either of them, at least not right now. So to try to fill Jason's shoes, we brought in not one, but two outstanding product strategy cohorts, Corinne Bissett, as well as Kirsten Stoner. Thank you both, ladies, for jumping at the last moment. Awesome
Thank
to
you for
have you
having
both.
me.
Now, you both are in Columbus, Ohio. Is that correct?
Nearabouts.
Nearabouts?
I live
So
a little
roughly.
north.
Yeah,
of
okay.
Columbus.
Okay, so I'm in Colorado. You guys are used to snow. Now, having moved from Arizona to Colorado used to snow, I see we've got some other locations in here. If you are joining us, in fact, even if you watch us on replay, feel free to throw in the comments section where you're viewing from, and we'll come check out the map over a period of time here. We've got a producer in Georgia, and we've got one of our production assistants also over in Europe. So we'll check back on this in a little bit. And also, feel free to drop in any comments, questions that you may have as we go along. So today continues one of our kind of ongoing topics this month around our cloud-based research. Now, Kirsten and Corinne, what we've been doing over the last couple of months is unpacking a whole series of research that Veeam has done. It's not specific to Veeam, meaning it's a blind third party. No one knows Veeam's asking the questions, but this is going to be focused on disaster recovery. And if we tee up our first slide, one of the things that we did is we took our data protection report. That's what that little DPR means in the corner. And our data protection report was the industry's largest global backup survey ever. And we just asked kind of a simple question here. I'd love to get both of your reactions. The question was really about the future of disaster recovery as it relates to self-managed, doing it yourself on the data center, or having a provider, a disaster recovery service as a provider. And before I kind of unpack and we chat through the trends here, just like to see what both of you have seen. Clearly, Veeam is committed to have partners, but maybe I'll go throw it to you first, Corinne. Anything interesting that you've seen or that surprises you about the direction of cloud and disaster recovery?
I wouldn't say I'm necessarily surprised the way that it's going towards this cloud marketing. I'm sure Jason said it on this channel earlier, is physical is not really happening right now, physical deployments. So we're kind of accelerating all of those plans to maybe we're going to do DR in 5 years, but now it was last year and this year because it's necessary. We need the DR and we need that equipment and the cloud has it.
Yeah, it's a great point. And, Kirsten, speaking of sort of recent world events, and unfortunately they're still with us, going forward, do you think we'll see more cloud adoption for DR as a result of global pandemic and some economic challenges?
Yeah, definitely, Dave. Just even over the years with the cloud, I work often in the Spiceworks community, and I see, users going to the cloud because it's an easier scale up option that they can use, especially when they want to maybe, turn on a virtual machine in the cloud, do an instant recovery to the cloud. And I think with COVID in general, it just accelerated things a little bit faster because people weren't able to, go into the data center or be in the office and fix things more efficiently. The cloud was there and it was a lot easier for them to get things done.
Yeah, those great points. And, I think directionally, we all as an industry kind of knew where we were headed. And this evidence or survey results shows the 2020, then the 2021 actuals. And just look at that anticipated adoption curve. It starts to spread upwards and upwards. So, there's probably no turning back now. And, as a result of having to make a pivot in the pandemic and people are having to make their bets, we're probably going to continue more and more down this trend. Well, let's take a look at now one of our next global data points. And then after that, I'm told we've got already a lot of happenings on our global map. We'll go parse that through. But if we look at now, why and how are we using the cloud for disaster recovery here? What's interesting is, that we've got two really high level responses, meaning number one and number two aggregate to basically 4 out of 5 of the responses. First is we use cloud-based storage to store off site data, but we intend to restore that data back on-prem to be able to access it. And the second one is really a flip. We configure to use cloud-hosted infrastructure as a service as a secondary site. Then we get down to purpose-built disaster recovery as a service. And then all the way down to only approximately 1 in 5 say we don't use any cloud services, part of our DR strategy. Corinne, love to riff with you a little bit on that notion of we use cloud-based storage, but we intend to bring that back on-prem versus fail over to it in the cloud. A lot of times we hear people want to do that. Does it seem interesting? I mean, you could argue it's almost a two-way tie for number one, right? At 1%, it's negligible. But how does this read to you?
I think this just kind of puts it out there. Cloud will give you anything you need that makes sense for your business. So you have these kinds of options. You don't have to commit to the cloud, but I'm sure there was even some kind of gray area between these two sections. Maybe they had a bad experience before, and it's all about planning. If they planned a little better for how they were going to fail over their infrastructure, they may in the end find out it's better. So I think these theoretical questions, I want to see what had actually happened in comparison to results would be very interesting. Because I know there's a lot of gray area here. Oh, it does work. It works even better than it did on-prem, and it's actually cheaper than they thought it could be.
Yep, good point. And, Kirsten, what's interesting is, and Corinne kind of touched on it, there is no one cloud. And there's also in the data center, there's no single workload or single service level agreement. So it can be reasonable to do really any number of these things that are listed here. Data center doesn't have to do, but make one selection.
Yeah, definitely. For sure.
Well, let's hit the map really quickly. I know that we've got a number of people that have come in. I see we've got Georgia, Mexico, Ireland, Senegal, Dubai, Argentina, Turkey, Florida, Spain, South Africa, Indiana, France, United Arab Emirates, Louisiana, United Kingdom, India, Illinois, Germany, Norway, Czech Republic, Pakistan, Romania, Brazil. If I didn't mention it, we've got, what do we have? 1, 2, 3, about a half a dozen of the U.S. states and going on 4 of the South American countries. So we definitely appreciate all that. And then multiple too. African countries and several Middle East as well. So awesome stuff there. So one of the things I'd love to kind of return to is, Veeam has held an opinion for a long period of time that, flexibility, choice are what's really very important, and being able to, over time, be able to ensure that you've got a platform, a service that can adapt to meet your needs. Now, I know, Corinne, when tech support, you got the chance to be on the front lines live speaking with people. Is that a reality, meaning people are looking to change or deploy or flex, or do you think that's more kind of marketing speak?
I don't think it's just marketing speak. And I think more infrastructures are getting into cloud without even realizing it, especially when it comes to software as a service. Dipping your toes in with software as a service and realizing you don't have to run those applications on your on-prem environment, and how much less of a strain it is on your IT. You don't have to have an application administrator for all of these different applications, and then starting to get into a little bit of the infrastructure as a service, and then finally kind of discovering what PaaS is. So platform as a service, I think, is what's really going to change the game when that starts to get out there and used more readily for infrastructure.
Yep, totally checks out. And I like the home studio there. That is very rocking. Very nice. Welcome to the continuation of the pandemic. 2021. It's just like 2020, but just one more. So, Kirsten, love to hear your thoughts as well. Longtime Veeamer. seen a lot of changes in how people are deploying backup and recovery and data protection. And we talk a lot about the cloud. Also interesting to note, though, do you think that necessarily means on-premises goes away in any meaningful shape or form in the next few years?
I think that really it's going to depend on your business and your organization. I think on-premises applications and deployments will definitely still be around. I always think about, when I think about the cloud and maybe why someone would go all cloud, or maybe have an on-prem and a hybrid strategy. When I think about all cloud, I always think about, maybe this is just me, but I always think about maybe a business that doesn't have, the right, all the IT staff to help, and maybe they're just getting started. Going to the cloud to have some applications up there might be helpful for them, so they don't have to maintain that on site and buy a lot of capital investments. If you already have those capital investments to support your data center, your infrastructure, your applications, it might not be the best fit for you to, start deploying everything into the cloud, because it's going to add more expense to your business. So if you already have, that's those servers in your data center, then I think a hybrid strategy definitely would be something that is considerate, and especially when it comes to disaster recovery, because you can send those backups to the cloud and either have it set up as a cold, a warm, or a hot site for those virtual machines or machines to be available to you.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and especially given the current sort of pandemic and resulting potential economic challenge. And Jason and I have been kind of riffing now, I think really ever since probably middle of last year, that this could end up being economically a lot like what we saw in the data center in 2007, 2008, where people hang on to their gear longer. So to your point, Kirsten, the ability to leverage what you've got, hang on to it where it makes sense, and then to think about expanding, or basically over time picking workloads where it's important or basically safe to do so. Evaluating things like cloud for DR makes sense. You don't have to go inordinately fast. And when you are going to the cloud, it doesn't mean data center goes to zero all at once.
I love the term hybrid.
Hybrid, yeah.
Hybrid everything.
Hybrid is a wonderful term. And I like how our co-founder likes to conflate. In one breath, he'll always say hybrid cloud, multi-cloud. And technically they're different, Kirsten, but I like that notion of saying both, because you get a lot in there very quickly. You get the notion of there isn't one cloud, and then hybrid, to your point, Corinne, means, well, there's on-prem too. So it's all of the above for many of us. It's not just either or. Cool. Let's dive into our next research finding. Now, busy slide here, but we're going to unpack it for you. On the left-hand side, prior to utilizing public cloud for disaster recovery, what kind of secondary sites did you use? And up at the top here, almost 60% said they used a third party for business continuity disaster recovery. About 1 in 3 said we do not have a secondary DR site, but we did have offsite copies via tape, yay tape. Almost a third then said, well, the organization owned a secondary site. And I have to tell you both, Corinne and Kirsten, seen this notion here of the organization owned secondary site go down more and more over time. And really to the point where what we're actually seeing is a shift where people aren't owning secondary storage. And you know what? I feel like I am probably talking to a different slide. There we go. The percentages are mapping up pretty cleanly there. So here we go. So 60% using the third-party site, roughly 30 were then looking at potentially doing something like tape, had their data offsite. Then some, 28% had their own data centers, and only 13%. So we did not have a secondary DR site, but we still have offsite data copies sent off to the cloud. Just like to pause on that and chat with both of you just for a moment on, are you seeing the same kinds of trends? And if so, how do you think this shifts out of the future? Meaning when you speak to people utilizing Veeam or just in the industry, Is that shift away from owning a secondary data center something that you've experienced as well?
I would say I think going into especially 2022 and 2023, that's going to become an even bigger kind of expansion because everyone's starting to work from home and we're figuring out it works. All of these physical places where we could send it maybe to site A could send it to site B and site B sends it to site A. And now we need even less infrastructure and on-premises environments. I can imagine the cloud just kind of growing and growing for that secondary location instead of having a secondary site.
Yeah,
Yep.
and I agree with that too, Corinne, because oftentimes too, as a secondary data center, a business might use maybe a different office potentially. So if we had our office in Columbus, maybe we have an office in, you know, Colorado. Sometimes businesses would replicate their virtual machines to that other office, and as we all work from home, one of the things I always think about is what's going to happen to all these office buildings. They're building all these offices. What's going to happen? Are they going to close down? And they might condense offices and stuff. So looking at maybe a potential service provider for DR to replicate your virtual machines or even to the cloud is a good option as well.
Yep, great point. I see a comment from Jonathan that says, in my experience, teams tend to neglect their DR and it's often not current data. And that is the challenge, isn't it? That, especially back in the day when you would send a whole series of tapes offsite. This is not a tape comment. It's just a comment on it was a very old version of data. And then you had to wait a long time to try to get it back. So that gap in the currency of the data oftentimes was something that was a real issue. So let's parse through now the right-hand side of this, and that is, speaking of tapes and things like that, how did you seed your cloud infrastructure? Replication comes out high, which is what you might expect from the cloud, really, but 54%. What's interesting is restored backups into a cloud location at 22, tape or some sort of portable disk shows at 16, and then specifically we asked about cloud-based appliances like Amazon Snowball or Azure DataBox. That came in pretty small at 6%, although some of those technologies are a little bit newer. What's interesting to me, and I'd love to get, maybe I'll start with you, Kirsten, your thoughts on replication. I could argue that at 54% is kind of high, but given that cloud, everything's supposed to be electronically vaulted as one of the premises, you could also say, maybe it's surprising it's not higher than 54%.
Yeah, definitely. Replication is one of the easiest ways to have your machine ready to start when a disaster does occur at your primary site. So it is surprising that not more people are replicating their data, but also maybe they're using tapes. Maybe they're using a service provider. So there's definitely different avenues you can go down here. But yeah, that's kind of what I think about that.
And Corinne, the notion of having to restore your data, your backups, restore that and point towards a cloud target as a means of seeding, ostensibly that sounds a little brute force. Love to get your thought.
Yeah, I was just thinking that I kind of wonder what the statistic would be behind we rebuilt it, but then migrated maybe just the back-end data entities, like migrating the databases, but making sure the infrastructure is more like cloud-oriented. It's not a one-to-one environment unless you run an infrastructure as a service, which tends to be more expensive in some cases than trying to get into the platform as a service range. So coming back to replicating that data, I imagine the data was replicated, but then they had kind of a hybrid situation where they built some components in the cloud to migrate that or attach it to, which is why that's not higher.
Yeah, okay, I like that analysis a great deal. And, I think what we're seeing here, it's a kind of a theme of there's multiple ways to exploit the cloud, multiple ways that you might have been doing DR prior, multiple ways to seed the cloud. And that all just kind of goes into why choice and flexibility becomes important. Even if those things shift over time, at any one period or point in time, you might be having to flex all of those, use all of those. So let's keep cruising now and hit our next data point around cloud-based DR recovery capabilities here. So on the left-hand side, we asked how our operations resumed for your disaster recovery function. And the top vote getter at 40%, recover on-prem, data is mounted in the cloud, and we execute from on-premises. So keep the data where it is. There's not egress, and we're going to spin up compute and then go and access that. Then down to a quarter say, we'll recover on-prem, data's offsite, and we need to pull that data back. So there's a potentially egress associated with that, latency associated with that. 22%, we recover in the cloud. We have pre-configured servers we just spin up, but the networking is manual. And then down at 12%, recover in the cloud, pre-configured servers, networking's all ready to go. In other words, Kirsten and Corinne, 12% are saying this is going to be very automated. We're using or fully exploiting a great deal of cloud-based resources. It would seem, Kirsten, like that 12% is kind of the ideal, like where many of us might be striving to get to. But there's a whole other range of possibilities here, with interesting one being that the data we recover on-prem, data is mountable, but we execute it on premises. Any sort of thoughts directionally where you think that might be headed?
Excuse me. It's definitely interesting always to get these surveys results and see what customers and industry people who work in the industry are thinking and feeling like. You would think that most of the time, if you were to have a disaster recovery in the cloud, you would recover in the cloud and turn up your application in the cloud. But there might be some other downsides to that, and that might make you want to recover, on premises. So I just think it's pretty interesting kind of to see where everybody's head's at, especially with the survey group that we surveyed.
Yeah, and Corinne, interestingly enough, a quarter are going to pull their data back. And do you think that raises a red flag? Meaning, are there concerns about egress fees or the latency it might take to do that? Or do you think latency is not really going to be a factor?
So if it's not planned ahead, I could see there being a huge problem with the egress fees that you're referring to or the latency. But a lot of these, at least public cloud providers, have a service that you can set up that kind of tunnels from their environment to your environment. And it may cost a couple $100s for a high-end version of this tunnel, but you mitigate all of those egress fees to pull that back down to your on-premises environment. And it also gives you a higher connection interface to that public cloud data. So it makes it very flexible to pull it back down. I don't see that necessarily being a problem as long as it's planned for properly.
Like that. Great points. Let's parse the right-hand side of this now. So when it comes to fail-over, fail-back mechanisms, top vote getter at approximately half, we've written scripts for reconnecting resources that are now running remotely. Now, I'm actually just going to pause right then and there. And Corinne, what are your thoughts on relying on scripts or solely on scripts, perhaps, in a disaster recovery situation?
I think automation is an administrator's best friend, and as long as you've had those scripts pre-written and tested before the time that they become necessary to use, it's fine. It's great. Not everything's going to automatically and natively kind of link to each other, and you got to do a little bit of nudge this way, nudge that way, so it's back in your environment the way that you expect it to be.
Yep. And, it would be remiss, Kirsten, if we didn't give a commercial and a shout out to our Veeam availability orchestrator, who our good friend Melissa Palmer really likes to champion. VAO, or the notion of being able to invoke a broader orchestration engine in a disaster recovery situation, has a lot of benefit too, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. being able to set up a plan and test a plan before a disaster happens is really the key to any disaster recovery plan. And VAO makes it a lot easier to be able to orchestrate that disaster recovery instead of having to manually fail over and perform failbacks. So it makes things a lot easier to plan and to test your disaster recovery plan.
Awesome. And I see we've got a comment from Brent that says, quote, exploit the cloud. That's perhaps my greatest concern as corporations consolidate to a few major cloud providers. Harmful effects of an exploit against those providers amplifies, meaning sort of, there's a phrase, see if it translates globally, but, put all of your eggs in one basket, or meaning become more dependent on fewer things. And I would kind of say one of the ways that we look at Veeam to be able to mitigate against that risk is through data portability and cloud mobility, meaning the ability to get your data across clouds, back on premise if you should need to, and obviously be able to send data to the cloud. But that fluidity of data or big data portability, I think, is a key one. So let's hit the map one last time. I think we've got now 5 more countries that have come in, if I look at that correctly. We've got Kurdistan, Malta, Italy, Zambia, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. We've got Michigan, New Jersey as well. So, and look at Europe. Europe is like halfway lit up approximately, doing really good there. I'd be curious to know if it's still snowing in Spain, and it is in interesting places in parts of North America here. So awesome to see, and awesome that so many of our folks down in South America, Africa, and Middle East are able to tune in as well. Maybe, Kirsten, as we begin to wrap up, we've got a major release of Veeam that's coming out shortly here, and we've got actually a special event associated with that. Maybe tell us just a little bit about that, I think we've got a content slide on that as well.
Yeah, as most of you know, well, if you don't know, now you'll know, but Veeam V11 is coming. We're having a special live launch event on February 24th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So set your alarm clocks so that you can be up and ready and with your coffee to tune in. And we're really going to talk about, some of these great new features that V11 is going to bring, continuous data protection, expanded instant recovery, and more. So you can register to attend at this link at the page, go.veeam.com/V11, and you'll be first to know what's coming, and it's going to be a really exciting, fun time.
Yeah, I've been now almost 3 years at Veeam, and every year has had a major release associated with it. Every year we keep talking about like a half a dozen really killer features and then 150 more, and this year is no exception. So while we're kind of looking ahead, Corinne, maybe tell us a little bit about what people can look to see this Friday on the Veeam channel as well.
So we have some highlights on lab strategies and some tips for career development within the backup industry, and some great tips just all the way around when getting into the tech community and what you can do to make sure you're on the right path.
Brilliant. And then 1 week from today, Jason and I both hope to be back on the live stream. We're going to conclude our month-long February look at cloud and backup in particular, and kind of double click on who's involved, what are the roles currently associated with that practice, and then riff a little bit about how we think that's going to proceed going forward. Thank you so much, Corinne. Thank you so much, Kirsten, for jumping in. They came in hot at the last moment, literally, so really appreciate that. That's how we roll at Veeam. And everyone out there, stay safe, stay positive, and depending on where you're at, stay warm. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next live stream.
Thank
Bye
you.
for now.
Thanks.